we're facing an enormous global challenge in the coronavirus. This is not just a US problem or a European problem or a China problem. This is a shared challenge, and we need to have policies that reflect that shared challenge. At home, obviously, we're very focused, as the administration is, as the Congress is, as state governors are, as the business community is, on the public health and safety of our citizens. But we also recognize that beyond the public health challenges we face and the stress on our hospitals that probably will come in the weeks ahead, we also have, of course, an economic stress resulting from the coronavirus. And so what we want to do is focus on mitigating those risks, making sure that supply chains work, that trade flows, that we make sure that the necessities that need to get to Americans are provided in the shelves. Business wants to be a part of the solution. They want to help their employees. They want to make sure that they have the funding to support them. And of course, we don't want widespread cessation of economic activity because we don't want job losses. We don't want our economy to struggle. And of course, we want to continue as much as possible in our economic activity, while at the same time ensuring that we have the safety and health of our citizens first and foremost in our mind. So businesses are spending a lot of time thinking about the right balance here, how to help their employees, how to provide them with safety, but also at the same time, how to keep functions moving. We've seen a lot of market volatility. I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of my slide presentation. And we, of course, have seen a rise in coronavirus cases outside of China where it started. And so we're maybe in the United States beginning to see a rise here, and we'll see what happens going forward. It's an unsettling time for people. My staff is all mostly working remotely, and that is true for a lot of businesses in cities like Washington and New York City. So bear with me as I go through this PowerPoint presentation. I will cover, as Chris asked me to, the trade and supply chain issues affecting the American business community. But of course, I expect many of your questions will also be about the coronavirus and the impact. I hope that we work together as a community. I hope that the community is not just the community locally, but globally, of course, nationally and globally. I'm encouraged that governments are trying to do more on that front, but we need to share expertise, whether it's dealing with medical supplies or dealing with other kinds of supplies that need to keep the economy going. Let's not forget that 70% of our economy is based on consumer spending, and should consumer spending go down as expected through this period of time, turmoil, this is going to affect, as it is, a lot of industries, from the aviation industry, tourism, of course, retail, and many other industries. Particularly consumer-facing industries are feeling the brunt right now, but even the manufacturing industries, the B2B businesses will feel it as well as supply chains have choke points. And so we want to make sure that our borders remain open for goods to flow and that we continue to operate as best we can. So with that in mind, let me go to the first slide, if I can do this. And Chris, I'm having issues sliding over.
Yeah, I should be able to use the right and left arrows.
Yeah, it's not moving as it was before. So let me, yeah.
Okay, we will, our Tyler in our control room will work on that. If
let me just keep, go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you wanted to tell the listeners out there that you're happy to hear from them after this program, and I'm passing on your email to them, mbrilliant, MBRILLIA @uschamber.com. So Myron is an excellent source and resource for journalists to have. So I hope people will be able to reach out to you going forward.
Well, why don't I, Chris, go ahead with I have a copy of it. Why don't I go ahead and we can catch up, because it's not working right now, the slide, for whatever reason. It was working earlier. So let me just say that there are three issues that I thought I would take up today. Why is international trade and commerce so important? I hope that that one is self-evident, but I'll just mention it briefly. What do I see as the pressing trade issues of the day? And of course, when Chris first approached me weeks ago about this, he wanted me to focus on the U.S.-China relationship. But I want to touch upon a few other issues as well. And then how has the coronavirus impacted the trade agenda? Chris, I have you now on my screen, by the way.
Okay. Yeah, we're working on the PowerPoint.
So let me give you the global picture to begin with. As many of you know, the World Trade Organization is the body that has been the disciplinarian on trade rules. But if you look at what the WTO does also in terms of giving us data, global trade volume has nearly gone up 4 times, from about 5.2 trillion to 19.5 trillion since 1995. In 1995, 29% of the global population, which was about 1.65 billion people, lived in what we would call extreme poverty. By 2018, this number has been cut to about 8.6%, 650 million people. Way too many still, but clearly an improvement. Now, trade is a significant factor, not the only factor. Productivity, technology has also done that, but trade has helped bring down the poverty rates in countries like China, increasingly in India and other places around the world. The benefits for trade to the United States economy is clear. If we only sold to ourselves, we'd be selling to 5% of the customer base. 95% of the customers live outside the United States. Roughly 39 million jobs, or about 1 out of 5, are tied and dependent on trade. And of those employees that are tied to trade, most earn significantly more than they do in jobs that are not tied to trade. In trade-intensive industries, earn over 50% more than the least trade-engaged sectors. There are a lot of reasons for that, but it's clearly showing that trade has some significant impact on the daily lives of many Americans. Now, often I'm asked, what does the United States want? What does the business community want? Well, of course, we want to be guided by certain principles. We want a level playing field, meaning that we want to be able to have the same opportunities in foreign markets that we have in the United States. Sounds easy, but it's not so easy. We want to expand trade around the world. We want it to be premised on reciprocity, meaning that you get opportunities to do business in our market if you're in a country, China or India or Brazil or in Europe. At the same time, we need to have access to your market. It means we should have it on the same basis. The tariff rates should be the same. The investment climate should be the same. The kinds of standards and regulations, the environment for intellectual property. We want to promote jobs. We want to promote jobs in our economy that flow from trade commerce. Now, when the WTO, the World Trade Organization, was developed, it was developed with that concept in mind, to provide rules enabling fair competition. Now, there's no question there are gaps. As the WTO advanced, it didn't always take into consideration new technologies. There are still issues that are not fully square handled in the WTO context, for example, like subsidy practices of countries. And in fact, what might shock some people is that the United States ranks about 130th out of 136 economies in tariff face, meaning that we have much lower tariffs than the countries that we're doing business with. And the United States has only free trade agreements with 20 countries. The issue of free trade agreements is often misunderstood, because really what we're talking about is free and fair trade agreements to prevent countries from creating disruptions in doing business with us. But if you compare how many countries we have FTAs with say, the EU, which has it with over 100 countries, you can see that in some cases we may not have the access to the market that we should, because Europe has developed trade agreements that are providing preferential access to their trading partners for their companies doing business in their markets. China, by the way, has 23 countries which they have free trade agreements with. And while we would not say their trade agreements are the same as the United States, which tend to be more comprehensive in nature, there's no question that they've been aggressive in recent years to lock down trading routes and relationships around the world. There are a lot of issues that the WTO doesn't take into consideration effectively. Things like subsidies, which I mentioned, data localization, services, intellectual property. These all remain challenges, and it's why the U.S. sometimes decides to move along in a bilateral rather than multilateral fashion because there are gaps in the World Trade Organization. Let me turn to the U.S. trade policy under President Trump.
Okay, and just so you know, Myron, sorry to interrupt, but Tyler is controlling the slides now, so if you, as you're going from one to the next, he'll follow along with you, and you can maybe just say.
Let's move to the U.S. trade policy under President Trump. There.
Okay.
Now everyone should be getting the slides on in sync with my discussions. If I look at how trade policy under President Trump has changed in 2017 to 2019 compared to, say, previous presidents, and I've, again, worked on trade policy for a very long time with many administrations, there's no question there's a more muscular approach being undertaken by President Trump. But he's not the first president. This is not the first administration that's tried to challenge unfair trade practices in other countries. Every president has asked their administration, their cabinet officers to address these issues, going back a long way. And so what we have seen, though, is a more muscular approach. And I would say President Trump has been more engaged on trade than any president that I've worked with or any administration in over 30 years. President Bill Clinton did work heavily on NAFTA and, of course, on China's entry into the World Trade Organization. But this president, President Trump, has been consistently engaged on the trade agenda. We haven't always been aligned with the President Trump. We're aligned with addressing unfair trade practices, in leveling the playing field, in creating more markets for American manufacturers and farmers and small businesses, and helping, of course, our employees, helping labor. But we haven't always been aligned with the imposition of tariffs. You've seen in the last few years, prior to 2020, the imposition of sectorial tariffs on steel and aluminum, and you've seen the threat around auto tariffs with Japan and Europe. You have seen some progress on some mini deals by the administration, namely with Korea and Japan. These weren't comprehensive deals. We already had a free trade agreement with South Korea, but this was an amendment to that. And then with respect to Japan, we don't have a free trade agreement with Japan, but we did reach some kind of a combination with Japan around some areas, including on autos and in the space of agriculture. Agriculture has been a central theme of the president and the administration in tackling what they perceive to be unfair trade practices in foreign countries who aren't buying enough American produce. We've had tough negotiations, as everyone knows, in the past year and a half, 2 years on Mexico and Canada, which led to the U.S.-Mexico-Canadian agreement, which was reached and ratified or went through the Congress early this year. That's a good deal, and I'm going to get to that in short order. Of course, it builds on the existing NAFTA framework. But they were tough negotiations. The president at times threatened to withdraw from NAFTA. He didn't ultimately do that, and his team ultimately negotiated agreement with Mexico and Canada. And clearly something I'm going to speak to at some length is the elevated tensions on the U.S.-China front. Moving to the next slide, I want to focus on the USMCA for a second. If you could move to the next slide. What does move back one slide, please, Tyler? Okay, no, keep going forward, Tyler. I'm on the slide. What does USMCA do? There you go. So if I look at the US-Mexico-Canadian agreement, it was a very critical agreement to do. People will say, well, what do you have there? Well, first of all, it preserves NAFTA. That's important. Secondly, it modernizes the trade ties with Canada and Mexico. We made improvements in the digital space, new rules on services, on non-tariff measures. Of course, NAFTA supports 12 million jobs. It's as big as the next 11 markets for manufacturers, and it accounts for 1/3 of all U.S. agricultural exports. So there would have been a lot of disruption in trade flows, in supply chains, had we not gotten a modernized NAFTA. So that's good. There is still an issue of when does it come into force. It will come into force at some point. There's discussions on how to do that. There are outstanding issues around the environment and IP that linger that are still subject to discussions between the Congress and the administration and, frankly, the business community. But we're pleased that this agreement was done. I think it settled the markets, along with what I'll talk about next is the U.S.-China relationship. So turning to Trump and U.S.-China relations, the next slide, please. If you think about the most important bilateral relationship we have today, I don't think there's any question about it. As important as the relationship is with Europe, as important as the relationship is with Mexico and Canada, from a geopolitical standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and in so many other ways, the U.S.-China relationship trumps everything, literally, figuratively. The relationship has been, I think, not just a cornerstone of the global economy, but frankly, how China and the United States work on issues, whether it's climate, whether it's technology issues, whether it's trade, and many, many other areas. Counterterrorism is going to be critical, I think, on so many levels. These are the two largest economies in the world. China's trade volume has nearly gone up 4 times, with the United States growing to 600 billion. And while we have frictions on many levels, the frictions that have really elevated during the time of Trump and Xi Jinping, China's president, in these last few years have really been around trade and technology issues. So whether it's market access barriers, which have been going on for a number of years that we've been trying to address, state subsidies in China's system, intellectual property theft, and forced technology transfers, issues that have been covered widely by journalists. These issues have gotten a lot of attention, as have national security issues. We've learned a lot about Huawei and the concerns that our agencies have about Huawei and the telecommunication networks. We've learned a lot about human rights concerns. Of course, Hong Kong has come up, as has Western China issues, the Uyghur issues. In 2018, many of you are familiar with, the administration launched a 301 investigation that led to successive tariffs being imposed and, of course, trade talks being launched in Argentina with the 2 presidents and their teams. The United States Chamber of Commerce actually provided a lot of input into that 301 investigation. And if you look at the report, you'll see us cited quite a bit because we shared the concerns that the administration had as it relates to these market access barriers, state subsidies, how they are impacting and distorting trade in China, and of course, IP theft and forced technology transfers, among other issues. If I turn to the next slide, I'm giving you a landslide. Could you turn to the next slide, Tyler? There you go. If you look at what the U.S. government asks for, I think it was a very fair list of items and one that we supported. The government wanted to see expanded market access, to see fair and reciprocal treatment, eliminating subsidies, which was a big ask because you're basically going to the state system in China, stronger intellectual property protection, removal of digital trade and data restrictions, forced data localization, the inability to move data across borders, and the fact that the government in China wanted to capture that data for national security considerations is a big issue for not just the tech industry, but financial firms and many industries that use data effectively in their businesses. And of course, they wanted to see deficit reduction What did they get in phase one in these negotiations? Well, we certainly supported the phase one negotiation, but we didn't get everything we wanted, but we got some things that were helpful. The administration wanted purchase commitments, and they got that. They wanted something on currency. They got that. They wanted to see China commit to open up their financial markets and greater commitments on agriculture. They got some of that. They wanted to see reforms in intellectual property area. China wanted to do that because it was in their own self-interest to help their own domestic industries. Obviously, China is growing and growing not just from a trade standpoint, but innovating more in their own country. We see more and more industries developing their own technologies in China. So advancing intellectual property protection was in China's own self-interest. We did not see the end of forced technology transfer issues, but we saw some promises made and incorporated in things like the foreign investment law in China, which has gone into effect. Bottom line is, I think the phase one negotiation was critical as we moved to the phase one deal purchases. Critical, but it was not the end all. We have more work to do. If we could move to the phase one deal purchases, next slide, Tyler. If you see what the administration really focused on in terms of purchases, it's quite a big commitment they're looking from China from. If you see in each of these areas, whether it's manufacturing, energy, services, agriculture, the numbers they're looking to get to the $200 billion number on top of the 2017 $186 billion number increase in purchasing, you can see how it breaks down by the different sectors of our economy. But these are significant numbers. Even if we didn't have the coronavirus, these numbers would be difficult for China to meet. There is an element of managed trade in this. The Chamber has never been a fan of managed trade, but we are understanding of the need for China to buy more goods and services from the United States. If I could move to the next slide, please. If you think about, therefore, what did the U.S. Chamber expect this year? We expected the phase one deal to be beginning to see implementation, more purchasing, more commitments implemented that were made in the phase one. That also meant reducing tariffs. The administration had agreed to reduce the tariff rates on some of the existing $360 billion of tariffs that were in place, but not on all. In fact, only on the tariffs that went into effect September 1st of 2019, you see a 50% reduction on the tariff rate, but none on the original 250. So we saw some reduction as part of the phase one. We expected to see these tariffs reduced and hopefully de-escalating some of the tension short term in the relationship. The other thing that we've been pushing along was the phase two negotiations. Both sides had committed in principle to start phase two negotiations to get at these core issues that were not addressed in the phase one negotiations. Issues around subsidies, issues around data, more in-depth language and commitments on forced technology transfer, for example. And even though those negotiations would be probably moving slowly this year, we did expect the two administrations to commit to moving forward. But of course, what happens? We get the coronavirus, and that has interrupted everything. Let's move on to the coronavirus and the China impact.
Myron, if I could stop for just 1 second. Just a heads up to our listeners or viewers out there, we are getting some questions in. I'm cataloging the questions, and we'll kind of turn to a full Q&A session, when Myron is done with his presentation, probably in 5 or 10 minutes or so. But we're getting some questions. Ask some additional questions on these topics specifically, or general trade questions that you'd like to hear from top official at the U.S. Chamber. We will get to the questions in a few minutes. So sorry to interrupt, Myron, but go on back.
Thank you, Chris. Let me just quickly go through a couple of these slides that show the impact of the coronavirus. First on China, where the coronavirus started. And probably the first cases were late November and reported out obviously 6 weeks later. So there was a delay. The first quarter results in China are going to be very bad. there is a wide range of views about how bad, but somewhere between -2% to 4% is what the GDP will be like in Q1. And Q2 will also be bad. The idea that China will meet a 6% figure for the year is probably not going to happen. Even if you get a rebound and you see China's machinery, meaning their manufacturing, resume in earnest in April and May, it's just there isn't going to be enough demand globally, given what's going on, for the economy to completely rebound and get close to the 6%. So I think we're much lower than that in terms of economic growth from all the people I talked to. You saw what China did to try to quarantine workers and supply chains, and you see that it had some impact in the recovery, or what we perceive to be their recovery. If we could move on. But I just want to make a few points about what we saw in China. We've seen consumption flatline. Hard to say where that's going to go. Property sales have crashed in China, and these charts demonstrate the impact of the coronavirus. Moving on, more impact. Transportation halted. Economic activity dropped. And I know I'm going through these slides quickly, but basically, you're seeing the impact of the coronavirus. The impact on global supply chains. We all know that China is critical to the global supply chains in many areas, including, by the way, in the medical area as well, pharma supplies. We've seen a reduced demand and travel restrictions in the first quarter of the year, disrupting flow of goods. We saw in LA, for example, in the port of LA, a projected 25% drop in container volumes. We're going to continue to see some of that going forward. I mentioned generic medicine core components. Look at how much we source from China. 80% of the United States sources, and India 70%. So we're seeing shortages in many areas, including in the auto area. So the impact on the global supply chains is beginning to be felt and will continue to be felt going forward. So where are we? Let's move on to where we are right now in bilateral relations. I think it's fair to say that the coronavirus has put not only a strain on global supply chains, but has put what I call the tension part of the relationship around these tech and trade issues on the back burner. They won't stay on the back burner forever. And of course, we have an election coming up in November, and we'll see who is the president following that. But I think these bilateral issues are going to come back in a big way, partly because of the coronavirus is accelerated due to what I perceive to be a relatively lack of progress in phase 1 implementation and very little movement, in fact, no movement on phase 2. So it doesn't really matter to me whether President Trump wins the re-election or Biden and Sanders when it comes to whether these issues are going to create more tensions in the relationship. The issues that have existed now in the U.S.-China relationship, the friction points, still have to be confronted, and they will be confronted by either a Republican president or a Democratic president going forward. I just wanted to touch upon a couple other trade issues real quickly before we go to your questions, because there are other issues on the agenda that people should be aware of. First off, this is a fragile time in the U.S.-EU relationship. The EU and the U.S. created the WTO system, created the global trading system, and we need to work together, not only because we have a huge trading and investment relationship, over $5 trillion, and of course, millions of jobs tied to our economies, but we have now seen increasingly some friction points in our relationship around sectorial issues like the Airbus-Boeing dispute or around autos. There is these negotiations going on between the US and EU, a mini deal, which would provide only modest gains that would deal with some of these issues, including areas like digital service tax issue. But we're not sure when that will get done. There is the reality that on March 18th, that unless the administration decides otherwise, that the tariffs placed on goods from Europe as a result of the Airbus-Boeing dispute will go from 10% to 15%, and then Europe will respond, and then we'll be elevating again the tensions in relationship. There is also the fact that the EU, because of perhaps in part because they perceive the administration to be quite muscular in their trade policies, the EU also has quite an aggressive agenda, whether it's on AI, on digital, on competition policy, on Green Deal, green growth agenda that they have. They're boosting their own competitiveness, but perhaps at the expense of others, and targeting U.S. industries, particularly the tech industry. So we're watching that very carefully. I just came back from Europe, met with commissioners, met with officials also in UK. I want to move to U.S.-UK trade relations because you hear a lot of talk about the special relationship and the fact that the United States wants a trade negotiation with UK, perhaps a free trade agreement. It is true that we would support such a talk, but first the UK and EU must resolve their trade talks. And as far as we can tell, there is no certainty that there'll be a trade agreement between the EU and UK. In fact, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been pretty clear that he'll exit without a trade agreement. That would create havoc for UK-based companies. American companies operating in the UK who do business in the EU would be subject to new rules and regulations, different tariff rates, and it would also complicate our negotiations with the UK, even though I see there's some opportunities there, and there will be negotiations between the United States and UK. I just don't see a trade agreement being done before UK, EU finish their talks. This is important to note because we have a lot at stake, American companies, in what happens between the EU and UK, and we don't want to overlook that as much as we pay attention to the US-UK trading relationship. Just moving on, in the interest of time, as I've said several times throughout this discussion, there is a lot of uncertainty right now around the coronavirus, COVID-19. Clearly in the United States, we're just beginning to feel the impact on our lives. Many of us are working from home, the impact on stores and businesses, retail, obviously, tourism, and many other facets of our life that we take for granted. We'll see what the impact is on trade volumes. Certainly, we're pushing for policies in the federal government and in Congress that will help reduce that, mitigate the risk, help small businesses, help the debt issues, help make sure that employees are taken care of through this period. And that is going to be a focus of organizations like the U.S. Chamber. We'll continue to take advantage of opportunities to raise our concerns about tariffs and, of course, protectionism worldwide. These are going to continue to be issues that we have to confront well past the coronavirus period. But they're challenging in an environment where governments are really focused on the short term, not the long term. And there are other issues like reforming the WTO process. But let me just stop there because I tried to cover a lot of ground in a short period of time and open it up for questions, Chris.
All right, well, thank you very much, Myron. So talk to me a little bit about the what's going on in China right now with manufacturing. I mean, factories were closed, or many of them were largely closed, but I'm hearing that capacity is starting to reopen again. What are the latest numbers on that, and when does that translate into Chinese economic activity and trade, with and to the U.S.?
Chris, thanks for that. We've been in touch with our American chambers on a regular basis. They've been surveying companies, American companies doing business, and of course, I've talked to other people in China to get a feel of that on a regular basis. Here's what I can tell you. Certainly, President Xi Jinping has encouraged as quickly as possible for companies to get back to do business, but it takes a while to ramp up. First of all, employees have to feel safe and feel comfortable coming back. And so what we're hearing is that while factories are beginning to operate again, they're not yet operating at full capacity, more like somewhere between 40 and 60% on average. That's going to change over the next few weeks because the curve has been bent in China, at least the short term. Who knows what happens down the road when people start coming back in groups and what that does for the coronavirus again in China. But right now, they've bent the curve. They're encouraging people to get back to work. And that machine will start to drive their economy. but it's going to take a while. It's going to lag. And so I don't think anyone should expect China to be operating at full capacity anytime soon. That's their intention, but I think it's going to be weeks, if not still longer than that, before China is moving at 80, 90, 100% capacity. Of course, they're also impacted by the supply chain challenges around the world as other economies are facing the coronavirus and still spiking up, like the United States and Europe. That's going to affect demand and continue to create some shocks in the system. So yes, I'm encouraged that China is beginning to get back to business, but it's going to be a while before it's regular. And where we are, of course, concerned is making sure that the inputs that we need from China reach our supply chains and help our companies back here in the United States.
And how about other countries that are intertwined with U.S. supply chain issues? I mean, what's been going on in South Korea manufacturing and other countries that have seen significant coronavirus cases?
Well, look, we're not just dependent on China for the supply chains. We obviously, multinational companies source from around the world, from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, from obviously Central America to Mexico, even from Europe. So the supply chains are very connected. But what I would say is, as we've seen the spread, South Korea, Iran, of course, which doesn't impact our trade flows, we've seen it from Europe increasingly now that it's gone past Italy. What it does is it creates complexities in the supply chains on many different levels. If you don't have employees at the ports, if you have bottlenecks at the ports, if you're not having containers with full goods, if we're not able to meet our demands. Now, I think that China is a huge issue in the supply chain network, but it's not the only issue. Implicit in your question is, how will disruptions in South Korea or in Europe going to impact us? They are going to impact us. Let's not kid ourselves. They are impacting us. It's going to be worse in the weeks ahead than it's been in the past few weeks. So expect some disruption, and we just don't know yet. I mean, companies, again, are looking through their supply chains to see if they can source from different places. But we all know that moving a supply chain is not a short-term fix. It's expensive and it takes time. So the idea that we're going to see a massive movement of supply chains at this time is probably unrealistic. On the other hand, you're going to have to be creative in your sourcing. And I think that's what companies are trying to do in this time period.
Okay, so we have some questions from some of our viewers out there. On USMCA, do you expect this is from a journalist at Inside US Trade. Do you expect USMCA to enter into force on June 1st? And can you talk a bit more about outstanding issues with implementation of USMCA?
Well, the administration has talked about June 1st. I think it's not a date that we think should be hard and fast. I think the coronavirus has created some problems with implementation. And I don't think we want to see disruptions right now with trade. So I think there is some concern about that June 1st deadline, candidly, from the business committee. And we are having consultations with the administration about that. There was talk about June 1st from some officials in the administration, but it's not a hard, fast date. It doesn't have to be a hard, fast date. And we encourage some flexibility in light of the coronavirus and the difficulty companies are going to have in complying with the new rules of origin. That's the big issue. And so making sure that we have that flexibility so the industry isn't hurt at a time they're already struggling with the coronavirus. We don't want to pile on by creating some arbitrary date. So I'm confident that the administration is beginning to hear that from different businesses. We're certainly also communicating that. So that's one issue. And so the big question for us is giving transition periods that make sense for business, because we don't want not only businesses, big and small, to be impacted. We don't want the employees to be impacted by rash decisions around supply chain issues.
Okay, so kind of on a related point, how real is this? How real is the fear of COVID-19, the COVID-19 outbreak triggering U.S.-China economic decoupling?
Well, I've never been a fan of the concept of decoupling. decoupling suggests that the two largest economies won't work together and are not interconnected. On trade, we are certainly interconnected. American business is going to continue to do business in China, and we're going to continue to want to see Chinese sell goods and provide opportunities here in the United States. We have to change the terms of which we do business. We have to ensure that China is abiding by international standards, that they're addressing our concerns around subsidies, that their practices, that they're addressing our concerns around forced data localization, and that they're addressing many other concerns we have. But decoupling on trade makes no sense to China, the United States, or the global economy. And third countries don't want to be in a position of having to pick between the United States and China. These are the two dominant economies in the world, and it's important that we find a path forward on trade. More work is needed on that front. On technology, which is really the root, I think, of the friction between China and the United States, this is a problem. There are definitely concerns about this self-reliance system in China. There is more national policies being adopted in China today over the last 5 to 6 years, particularly during the Xi Jinping era, around promoting domestic champions. It's okay to invest in domestic industry, but if you do that in a way where you're subsidizing it, or you're forcing technology transfer, or you're stealing intellectual property, particularly in the patent areas, these are big concerns that American companies have, that our government has. And here we do see policies like the 2025 policy of China that has created ambiguity about what is China's aspirations. I don't think China can go alone on technology. Even in the race to 5G or in other areas, quantum computing, for example, it can't go alone. It needs to be part of an ecosystem. It still relies, for example, at least for the next decade, if not more, on U.S. semiconductors as part of its supply chain. In order to be effective, we need to also rely on China, and we need to work with Europe as well. So I'm hoping that Europe and Japan and the United States can work with China to bring China into the global system, not just on trade, but on these complex technology issues. But Chris, it won't be easy. This is going to the core of China's economic model, and China has resisted some changes there, as they did in the phase 1 negotiations. So there's a lot of tension over these issues. You see it in the national intelligence communities, you see it with our defense strategies, but you also see it with the business community. And again, the business community doesn't want to be caught between China and the United States. It wants to encourage China to be a responsible stakeholder in the global trading system, but we've got to confront these technology issues. So huge issues, they're not going away. They'll come back in force no matter who wins the White House in 2020. Okay,
so I have a couple questions dealing with medical technology issues. Let me read them both to you. One is from somebody, International Trade Today. The Post reported that Iran asked for sanctions to be lifted so it could buy ventilators and was refused. Do you think that is appropriate? And also there was, I guess that's the main question. So if you could address that.
Our view on this is we need a global response to coronavirus. The U.S., look, it has to happen at the local level, it has to happen at the state level, it has to happen at the federal government, national level, but we need to work around the world in providing expertise, in helping each other with diagnostic testing, getting drug treatment to the market, and of course, making sure that we remember that first and foremost, this is a public health and safety issue. That's true here in the United States, it's true around the world. And the more we're working together on these issues, the better off we are. So should we make some exceptions because of the emergency situation we're in? Absolutely. There's no question there is behavior we don't like from Iran. Our government has been very clear on that. But when it comes to medical issues, we should be thinking in a global community sense and working on it. And I can say for sure, you look at what China is doing, they are now doing the right thing. Doctors from China are going to places like Italy and Japan and providing expertise. We should have had doctors on the ground in China early on, so we learned from what was happening there, so we would benefit from that in how we deal with our own people in our own country. So we need to think differently right now when it comes to these kinds of issues. We need to think about the humanitarian challenge we face, the challenge our public faces, and we need to think globally, not just in a provincial way. And that's true here and everywhere around the world.
Okay, so the related question, is there any information about what effect tariffs had on medical devices being imported, goods such as ventilators, respirators, gowns, and gloves?
Well, that has been an issue that we've taken up with the Congress and the administration, that we should find every opportunity to reduce barriers there. And of course, we have got to have ventilator supplies. We've got to have the ability to provide the kinds of treatments that we need for our citizens. And that includes obviously more testing. It includes having treatment facilities that are available. And it means having the ventilators should the time come when we have a crush on our healthcare system, which, I'm not a healthcare expert, but if you expect to see some stress on the system, then we've got to find a way to provide this technology as quickly as possible. So I think there is a real effort with the pharma industry, the medical device industry, to do everything they can here in the United States and around the world to make sure that the supply chains are operating and that we are able to produce as many as we can to meet the demands that we expect, the growing demands we expect.
Okay, so another different question from international.
And by the way, just in that vein, we're looking at tax policies and other policies as well that would help address these issues.
Okay, so also from international trade today, what do you hear about the drops in flights from China and Europe in terms of air cargo? Are the reagents needed for coronavirus testing sourced from Europe?
Well, I've talked to a number of companies in the logistics space, and of course, there's been a great strain on cargo because in transporting air, and of course, airlines provide some support. So the burden is falling on the FedExes and the UPSs and the DHLs and others to provide even more. So I'm hoping that the government is working very closely. I know they are. They're talking regularly to the leaders of these companies about that issue. We've got to move commerce. We've got to move goods. We've got to make sure that we can address the inspection needs, the testing of people who are part of the supply chain network so that they can function, and it's a challenge because obviously some companies are facing shortage of employees, and we need to make sure that we don't have a stoppage, a cessation of our trade, and that means making sure things can move from point A to point B, on container ships, and whether it's on airlines or whether it's through transportation vehicles like FedEx and DHL and UPS. So I know these conversations are ongoing regularly, daily with the administration and with other government officials around the world.
Okay, so we have time for running just about 4 or 5 minutes left overall. We have a few more questions I'd like to work in. The one is a general question about human behavior. Myron, economics and trade are strongly influenced by human behavior. How long after the virus halts would you expect trade and economic growth to fully recover?
Well, I think the origin of that question is that, it has to do with the consumer. How quickly will the consumer get back to its usual spending habits? As you remember, Chris, I said somewhat early in my presentation that 70% of our economy is dependent on consumer spending. And therefore, if consumer demand dries up because people are at home, they're not going online maybe to buy as much because they're uncertain about their jobs. Remember the millions of people in our economy that are on hourly wages as opposed to people who expect to be able to ride this through some period of time because they're employed, they have the insurance, they have everything else they need. But many Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And if they're not feeling that they're going to have their income restored quickly, or if they're worried about their benefits or anything else, they're not going to spend as much. So it just really depends on how long coronavirus is going to be a major factor in our lives. Is it a 4-week issue? Is it an 8-week issue? Is it 3 months? And again, we just don't know yet. But for the foreseeable future, clearly consumer spending is of concern. It's going to go down. We know that. And we know that a lot of businesses that are consumer facing are going to be impacted, right? The restaurants, the bars, the retail shops, the airline industry, these are already feeling the impact. Many of us, I've already canceled trips, as have many other people. That affects the bottom line. And so if we're not spending as we would normally spend, that's going to hurt our economy. So the question is how badly. That's not certain yet because it depends on how long the coronavirus is with us. So if you could tell me how long the coronavirus is going to be, then I can tell you how quickly the response would be. We can see a upturn after this, but you know, who knows how long it's going to be with us. If it's a 2-week disruption, that's one thing, but if it's a 3-month or 6-month disruption, that's a whole different deal.
Okay, and finally, this will be our last question. Is it your understanding that the U.S. government will grant China flexibility in implementing purchase commitments because of coronavirus?
I see there being little choice with the administration. I think China cannot meet its purchasing requirements at this time. I hope they would. Certainly, I hope they will continue negotiating a phase 2 trade deal with China. But we have to be pragmatic at the time. I think those purchasing targets were high to begin with. I certainly hope the Chinese were intending to meet them. But I think right now we're delayed significantly. Obviously, if you don't have your machinery up, you're not using as much oil and gas, for example. So they're not buying as much from us in the ag area. Now, some of that could pick up again because if China's economy starts to pick up, say in the middle to second part of the second quarter or into the third quarter, then they'll start to purchase more. But will they meet their targets for 2020? Unlikely. I think the administration is going to have to show some flexibility. But beyond even flexibility on the phase 1 targets, I think they're going to have to show some flexibility on tariffs because it hurts our country. It hurts our small businesses. It hurts employees. And I think we have to lower the tariffs right now. And this is an issue that we've been arguing for anyway, but the coronavirus, I think, makes it even more important to think about that. And I know there are different voices in the administration, but I hope beyond giving more time to China on the issue of purchases that they committed in energy, manufacturing, and ag and services, I hope they also reflect on the tariff policies that we have in place right now.